Lots of people are confused about what exactly Path of Exile 2 is doing later this year. Is it an early access? Is it a beta? If so, what's going to be in the early access or the beta? Is it going to be like other games that we've seen, like Diablo 4 or No Rest for the Wicked? And how am I going to get into this early access? Will it cost something? Well, in today's video, I'd like to delve into all of that because we actually do have quite a bit of information on it, and I'd like to provide some clarification because this has been the #1 question I've seen asked in comments, in Twitch chat. I stream on twitch.tv/talkative, by the way, and in a lot of different places. And I do have some information on this topic that I'd like to share with all of you, seriously, so that I can provide a complete answer. I know a lot of people are excited about Path of Exile 2. Obviously, I am as well. So people are interested in it. I totally get it. And they want to know when they'll be able to get a taste. So we're going to dive into that in this exact video. But before we do, I'd like to ask you, please click the like button and the subscribe button as well. I'm on the road to 25,000 subscribers before the end of the year. And after I asked for it in my last video, it was the video in which I received the most subscribers ever, basically of all time. It's only #2 after my first blow up video. So thank you all so much for that. I really appreciate it. And I'd really like to grow as Path of Exile 2 matures and launches later this year. So with all that mushiness out of the way, let's get right into the meat of the video and talk about what exactly we can expect with Path of Exile 2's early access later this year. Before we get into that though, I do have to address this screen right here. This is my desktop screen. I've got all my content creation stuff here and all the games that I play. Last video, I did a little bit of a gag wherein I have Path of Exile 2 and the Path of Exile 2 streamer client right here. If I was in the alpha for Path of Exile 2, nobody here would know it. It was only a gag. I just wanted to address it. Okay, now let's talk early access of Path of Exile 2 versus beta. Because before this year, they were always referring to Path of Exile 2's launch in 2024, 2023, and whenever it was supposed to be beforehand as an initial beta period. And what exactly does that look like? Well, we're going to get into that later in the video. But I've asked Jonathan Rogers this exact question before. When they changed from beta to early access, essentially what they're saying is this is just marketing. This is a good way to pitch your game right now. Lots of games go into early access. And if you look all the way back to Path of Exile 1, that's essentially what they did, even though it was called a closed beta back then. We are not going to get what we're seeing with No Rest for the Wicked, what we saw with Diablo 4, or even what we saw with another competitor in the space, Last Epoch. What we're seeing with Path of Exile 2 is going to be what we got with Path of Exile 1. So let's look at those competitors briefly and talk about their beta or early access periods and define what exactly they had and then what Path of Exile 2 is actually going to have. If we look for No Rest for the Wicked, that's the most recent example. It came out about a month, 2 months ago, and its launch was an early access launch. Unfortunately, the game obviously is unfinished. It didn't have a lot of content. When people finished it, they were left wanting more. There's not a lot of end game there. The story isn't finished. There's not a lot of build possibilities. There were a lot of features that were left unfinished. There's not a ton of quality of life. And while the developers are doing their best to remedy those issues, it's really in, I'm sorry to say, a sorry state. People shouldn't want to release their games even into early access in a state like that, right? Especially if you build up a bunch of hype leading up to that launch. Path of Exile 2 does not want to do that, and we'll look at exactly how they're going to address that in a moment. Now, let's look at the other person in the space, Diablo 4, and what they did with their beta period. Now, what this early access period for Path of Exile 2 is actually going to look like a beta of old. It's not the beta that we saw with Diablo 4. Diablo 4's betas were essentially ways to build up hype for the game. They were tidbits of content in a very short time span in which people could play, levels 1 through 25, basically the most polished versions of Diablo 4 and get a little taste, build up hype, get people to pre-order the game and go into it. And it worked. Diablo 4 was one of the most successful launches of all time in terms of sales. However, in those betas, they didn't get a ton of balance changes in. They didn't get a ton of feedback. It was primarily just people saying, wow, this game is so great. I can't wait to play it. The end game's going to be amazing because it's going to be just like what we saw in these first 25 levels. Obviously, that did not pan out. Again, that's not what Path of Exile 2 will be doing with its early access period. It's going to be a true beta. It's just being pitched as early access because that's the marketing scheme, right? That's what people recognize this sort of thing as now. And then finally, we have Last Epoch, which was in an early access period for a long time. I believe it was about 4 years. And they started much like No Rest for the Wicked. They didn't have a ton of content. Over the years, steadily, they kept adding more and more and more until they launched this year with their official 1.0 release. And then they added more content. Still, it's not even fully fleshed out, right? The end game is sort of lacking. People got bored. It has tons of character customization pathways. It has a lot of varied items and combat and all that stuff, but stuff is still lacking there, okay? And people are cognizant of that fact, including the developers over at Grinding Gear Games. Now, let's actually head over to Grinding Gear Games before we talk about Path of Exile 2's early access period and talk about Path of Exile 1. So development for this game started about in 2006 with 3 people in a garage, Chris Wilson, Jonathan Rogers, and Eric Olofsson, and they finally went into an early access period, actually a beta period as it was pitched back then, in 2011. Now, what this closed beta was the game soft launching, okay? It was people getting in there, playing the game, giving the devs feedback, and they had patches almost every single week. In fact, if you head on over to the PoE Wiki and look at the version history, wow, this is quite a packed page, and scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll get the closed beta period right here. All these patches were occurring super frequently. Look at all these patches. I'm just scrolling. They were updating the game with new gems, new items, new content, bug fixes, content updates, right? All throughout this period, they really didn't stop. Okay, and I think that's what we're going to be getting with Path of Exile 2, with a very key difference here. And let's talk about what that difference is going to be as pitched by the game director, Jonathan Rogers. When they changed the marketing from a closed beta to an early access, as we see on this web page right here, they knew they needed to set themselves apart from other games that were going into early access, okay? They didn't want to be even like Path of Exile 1 back in the day. They didn't want to be like Diablo 4's beta periods. They didn't want to be like No Rest for the Wicked. Jonathan Rogers has specifically said he was disappointed when he finished playing through No Rest for the Wicked because he wanted more content, right? They don't want to be like Last Epoch where they're taking 3 or 4 years to actually get into a 1.0 launch, and up to that point, it's really bare bones. Instead, what they want Path of Exile 2 early access to feel like is a fully fledged product. They want people to be able to hop into the game, play through it all the way to the end, get to that end game, and actually be able to, grind, be able to customize their characters, be able to play the game as if it was a full release. Now, Jonathan Rogers, lofty ambitions here, but essentially what he said in the past is that he wants Path of Exile 2's early access to feel like a fully fledged ARPG competing with all the other titles in the market. Now, with everything besides Path of Exile 1, I do think it will compete given what we've seen. In terms of content, I do think that it's going to be tough to beat Path of Exile 1, but it really does seem like Jonathan Rogers wants that to be the case. He's talked about already what we're going to be getting by the numbers. We're going to likely be getting 8 character classes, although they're aiming for more, on the launch of the early access. We're going to be getting the axe. We're going to be getting endgame fleshed out, likely some of the leagues. We're going to be getting hundreds of skill gems, hundreds of unique items, guys. Unique items we have not seen before. That's going to be crazy. They're going to be game altering. They're going to break the game, allow us to break the game. It's just going to be phenomenal. There's going to be all this stuff at our fingertips when Path of Exile 2 releases into early access, because what the devs want is a complete experience. They don't want you to be wanting more by the end of it. And that's another reason why they've been cooking for so long. It takes them a while to perfect this. They've been working on it for 6, 7 years at this point, okay? It's a long project, and it's going to show once it actually goes into early access. Another question I see a lot of people asking is, how long will this last? Well, Jonathan has given pretty much an exact date. He said it's going to last 6 months to 12 months, so about a year, depending on how fast they can polish the game and how quickly they can get ready for that official 1.0 release. This isn't going to be in early access for a long time, 1 year, 2 year, 3 years plus, okay? It's going to be out there for 6 months to a year, and then we're going to get a full 1.0 release, and then the leagues are going to start coming out, and that's going to be an exciting time. During the actual early access, you should expect, weekly patches, lots of content updates, tons of bug fixes, lots of communication from the developers. Grinding Gear Games is historically very communicative. I'm sure they're going to keep that up with Path of Exile 2's release. You're going to see a lot of videos from content creators like myself. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you want to see those videos, and you're just going to see a ton of excitement around the internet. It's launching right around the release of Diablo 4's Vessel of Hatred expansion, which is likely going to get a lot of eyes. That cinematic is probably grabbing a lot of people, getting them back in the game. Then they will experience the gameplay, and whether they like it or not, they might see some Path of Exile 2 stuff, a month later, and that will grab them as well. They'll hop into that experience, and, they might really find themselves enjoying PoE 2. If it's at a reasonable cost of entry. And that's what I'd like to talk about next. How will you actually get into early access? Because there's been a lot of debate on this topic, and I'd like to throw my hat into the ring on what exactly it will be. So let's talk about that right now. I may have been tricking you a little bit here, okay? Because before Path of Exile 2 became an early access title instead of a closed beta one, I think that with the closed beta, there was going to be paid access, right? They said they were probably going to fashion it after their 3.0 release for Path of Exile 1, The Fall of Oriath, in which people who historically supported the game with a lot of money could get in automatically. Then you could also buy your way into it. I think it was for $10 or $20. And then there were random keys that were constantly given out. That is not going to be the case with Path of Exile 2. That's my guess, at least. It being an early access title, I think they're going to get rid of that entirely. They've already said there will be supporter packs around the release of Path of Exile 2's early access. I'm sure they'll have $60, $100, $150, $300, $1,000 maybe packs. Maybe they'll go back to $1,000 like they did for some of their bigger releases in the past, or maybe they'll stick to $500. We'll have to see. And lots of people will buy them if the game is good. But I think what they really want to do, given that Path of Exile 2 is a free-to-play game with the early access, I think it's going to be free. I think they're just going to let as many people as possible flood into the servers and just test out the game. They really want to test out the economy. They want to test out all the balance. They want to see how people feel about the end game and the campaign. There's going to be a ton of stuff to test, and there's going to be a lot of buzz around it. And while Grinding Gear Games surely could make a pretty penny by selling early access for 10, 20, 30, heck, I think people would pay $40, $50 for it. I think what they'll do is what they've historically done with supporter packs, and they'll just make some massive packs. People will buy them because the game will be good and it will deserve that support. So there's my pitch right there. I think it's going to be free. If I'm totally wrong, I'll eat my words. Trust me, I'm the first person to admit that I'm wrong. I've made a lot of predictions over the years, including that Path of Exile 2 was going to release last year after ExileCon 2023. Wow, that did not happen. I was a little insane. I mean, I am pretty positive. In fact, Jonathan Rogers in an interview with Catmaster OP and Balor Mage said, quote, "Talkative Try is the most positive person in the universe," end quote. Not kidding there. So it's just bound to happen if you just have that positivity oozing out of you. But anyway, early access Path of Exile 2, I think it's going to be free. We'll see what actually happens. So truly, what you can expect with Path of Exile 2's early access is what a historic beta used to be, a game that will be changing, a game that the developers will be actively working on and taking your feedback, making alterations, making the game better, and a game that really will be a full one on the launch. They really want to make sure our experience is complete, that we have the campaign, all these different character customization options, the end game, hundreds of items. It's going to be a wonderful time, and I hope you all will participate, and I hope you'll join me in this journey and give this video a like to spread it to more exiles. Subscribe to the channel so I can reach that goal and hopefully surge past it, as many of you believe I will. And if you can't wait for the next video to come out, well, you're in luck, because I have a ton of Path of Exile 2 videos on this very channel, and you should watch one of these two right here, in which I'm probably hyping up Path of Exile 2 or giving my brutally honest, positive take. Anyways, that's all for this video. Talakura, Exiles.